Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Wednesday Investing System Show. It's another sort of interesting Wednesday to start off with. Looks like we got some weakness early on in the market here. And boy, as the news cycle has just been crazy since the last time I did the show. And it's just, there's like so much going on, and the market itself has been sort of in rally mode here. Let's take a look at the S&P 500 real quick. And so let's see, here we are. I got a lot of lines drawn on my chart. Last Wednesday was right here, and we were actually below what I consider to be the sort of zone in the sand, I guess you could call it. And everything, below that line, everything's kind of dicey because the market's close to potentially breaking down. And above that line, above that zone, I should say, the market is has the potential of actually breaking out. And as you can see, let me pull this down a little bit. There's some really important, really important areas on the chart. This one being extremely important because as we go over each week on the weekly chart, that particular line right there has been the upper end of what the market's able to do. The interesting thing is that, if the market was able to rally up and bump into that line, yeah, it'd be quite a rally. But in the outside event that anytime soon the market's able to rally up there, that's a new high, right? So see this old all-time high here is 30.28, and so there's some upside room here, right? I have this little sort of triangle, I guess you could call it, it's more like a wedge drawn on the chart here, and that's the first main area of resistance, which is not very far up. This is Fed Day, and we talk about this a lot on the show. And it's kind of been holding true. I've been been talking a lot about how the market likes to sell off shortly after the Fed comes out with an announcement. So it's going to be really interesting this time around to see. This is the day before Halloween. It's going to be interesting to see if they actually lower rates again, right? That's um, that's the big sort of area of debate right now. So it's kind of clear that the global economy is slowing. The U.S. seems to be doing okay, and today I believe it was retail sales came out a little weaker than expected, and so all these data points that come out make people question whether or not the U.S. consumer's in good shape, and so it's up to the U.S. consumer to support the global economy, I guess. But and then of course you get the Fed restarting QE, which adds a whole other dimension to things, right? That's kind of crazy, but yeah, lots of news. And here's the other thing is okay, there was Friday, right? There was all this trade negotiations and all this, and the administration really making a big deal about trade progress with China. Phase one of the trade deal with China was, a done deal in that, and then all of a sudden there seemed to be walking it back, right? China's coming out saying that until we drop the tariffs, they're not going to buy any agricultural products, and so quite frankly, I'm surprised that the market's still sort of holding where it is, like holding the upper end of this, because this little sort of last pop here was based on positive trade war headlines and phase one, and Trump said it was the best deal ever, right? And so, it's becoming increasingly obvious that it may or may not have actually been a deal. So, anyway, here's the last time that there was a Fed announcement, right? Market closed over 3,000 that day, the 3,006. So yesterday it finally poked above 3,000, and interestingly enough, it seems like every time that the S&P gets over 3,000, that's that's where the sellers start to come in. Like nobody's buying over 3,000 yet. So kind of interesting though. Kind of interesting. And so it is what it is. Market sort of just trapped in, in this little area here. And the biggest question to me right now, and I don't really have an answer, obviously, anything would be a guess, but the biggest question is, where on this chart does the S&P land on the 10:30 when the Fed announcement comes out, right? And I'm sort of thinking, it could meander and end up, around the upper end of this thing, and then obviously, the reaction to what the Fed says is going to be sort of the big deal. Interesting thing today that I'm noticing is that the strongest stocks in some of the strongest stocks in the market are the former leaders of the market, which are the software stocks, the SaaS stocks, getting hammered today, right? And in the past, that's sort of been that's one of those under the surface sort of things that denotes a little bit of potential weakness, right? It's always when the market's always a little dicey when the indexes hold up, but under the surface there's all this weakness, and so got to be got to be a little cognizant of that. Anyway, so here we are, kind of is typically these W type patterns in the past I've seen a lot of, and I don't know that this is so much of a W pattern, but when they break out to the upside, they tend to get follow through, right? This is an interesting downtrend line. If the market were to sell down to, and remember, these down moves into the 2800s, into the low to mid 2800s were like, end of the world type stuff when they were going on. So I mean, the market's right up here at, literally within spitting distance of the all-time high in the history of the world, and you got the Fed lowering rates and quantitative easing and all this stuff. So it's kind of strange, and it's just kind of strange. It's honestly strange. The other interesting thing is that, since the end of January 2018, the market hasn't really gone anywhere, right? Like this, that was the what I call like the parabolic run up. Market hasn't made a whole lot of progress since then. It's spent a lot more time, and so that was like, call it 2872 or whatever. Market spent a lot more time below that level than above it, and yeah, it's decidedly above it now, but hey, you never know. So anyway, this 2940 zone is the level to watch for support on the downside, and maybe the market just kind of meanders around in this area right here, and then I think the Fed announcement, and obviously the next day is Halloween, which is the end of the month. So yeah, so I mean October could turn out to be well, let's see, where did October start? October started with this big down day right here. Actually, it was like that was a big sell off, reminiscent of over here in August. Pretty big sell off. Everything was just looking just fine, and then you get that 2 day sell down, and then of course, it's been a lot of people saying that it's the trade war with China is what's driving everything, and so that's just been sort of a crazy, I mean, mixed signals everywhere, that type of thing. I like to look at the IWM. IWM is roughly 15%. I haven't done the calculation in a while, but 14, 12 to 15% below the all-time high, which was back here, kind of in nowhere land. And obviously, obviously this is a 2 year chart, and so where we are right now is basically on the small caps anyways, basically where it was, back here in, 2 years ago. With no progress at all in 2 years and, just probably halfway between the all-time high and the big sell-off there. So, financials right now or seem to be financials seem to be pretty hot is what everyone's talking about, right? Theoretically, good earnings amongst the big money center banks came out. As you can see, the big January 2018 sort of parabolic run up is still a long way up, right? So, all the professionals on Wall Street and TV, they always love the financials. I've talked about this for years, right? Um, and all through 2018, it was the Barron's Roundtable. Like 10 out of the 12 Barron's Roundtable people picked the financials as their number one sector for 2018. Well, as you can see, it ended up. Let's see, it ended up going from up here, or actually the beginning of January, but didn't pan out in 2018. Bounced back up, right back to where they were trading for most of the year in 2018, and they haven't really gone anywhere. And so this is still like a huge line of resistance. The thing of it is they don't move a whole lot, right? They're kind of boring and so I think more than anything they're kind of a safe idea because you can constantly talk about reasonable valuations this and buying back shares that and no matter what happens, chances are they're only going to move a couple of bucks in either direction. So percentage wise, that can be significant. But let's see, semiconductors. My chart seems to be acting a little slow today for whatever reason. Semiconductors, hey, they hit a new all-time high yesterday. So that's kind of interesting. Um, a lot of the semis, individual semis, Intel, still sort of struggling from this earnings miss. The ones off the top of my head, Micron nowhere near the highs. AMD, AMD's got a long way to go to get up to the highs, and so I look around at the semiconductors. Well, there you go, Texas Instruments. There's one that's hitting high, and so sometimes I wonder, when you look at these sectors, sometimes you wonder what's holding them up. The one that's really really is a disaster is energy, right? And so if you think about it, there's a 2 year chart. I should probably just ditch all this, no longer relevant, but 2 year chart of energy stocks, right? I mean, as I've mentioned for, the past 5 years, XLE is not a good proxy for the energy stocks because it's a third of it is just two companies. And so I always look at XOP. And the crazy thing about XOP, I mean, you remember like the sell off last fall, right? Market fell 20%. The energy stocks are like dragging bottom here, well below that low, and so that's that's something kind of interesting to note. And basically have lost half their value since since like this time last year. Pretty amazing. Pretty amazing. 21 bucks, 42 bucks, and so if you think about it, I don't know what to make of it. Tell you the truth, but every time they get a little rally, right? Like they had this rally back here when the Saudi energy facility got attacked. Temporary rally, and look right back down here scraping bottom, and so that's pretty amazing, quite frankly. But there's a lot of stocks in this particular ETF, and so every now and then you hear someone talking about energy stocks or whatever. But hey, and I mean it could theoretically be bottoming out here, but there's nothing attractive about this chart. Let's look EEM. EEM is always kind of an interesting chart. This is obviously emerging markets. It's got a little bit of it's got a little something going on here, I suppose. Not a huge fan of emerging markets at this point, simply because I mean, look how far it is off the high again. I mean, I looked through a lot of charts, and you go back to that big run up in January of 2018, right? And you look at a lot of charts, and a lot of them, a lot of big name companies peaked out in 2018, and so it's amazing to me that the indexes are able to, or the S&P anyway, is able to hold up so well given the fact that so many stocks and sectors in that peaked out, right? Um, Home construction has been a pretty strong sector, right? I mean, you go back, even this one of the strongest sectors out there, and you go back and you look, and there's that pesky, peak back when I was talking about. But in the near term anyway, this has been an extremely strong sector. As a matter of fact, we have there's an open trade right now, I believe, in which stock is that? No, maybe I'm mistaken. I must be mistaken because I thought there was a home builder stock. Oh well, I have to look through those. All right. So anyway, trying to think of any other noteworthy sectors. Oh, we're getting into earnings season here. That's another uh, that's another thing that we have forthcoming on the plate, and so looking through a bunch of the open trades right now. I see that still got a couple of weeks, right? But earnings season is going to start to come in fast and furious, and I think that's probably that's probably the next thing that's going to set the tone for the market, right? And earnings are actually expected not to be all that great. So, and I mean, and I've already, and so, expectations are low, and perhaps then they'll be able to beat expectations, which would probably be good. But yeah, I mean, quite frankly, with everything going on, I want to look at Apple because Apple's like the bellwether of the market, right? And so here you go. Apple has finally. This is pretty interesting, right? I mean, if you look back here, that was October of last year when it hit this high, and and it's finally back to making a new high or whatever. But kind of incredible this trip that it made all the way down in the fourth quarter, and then of course it's been a wild ride. But so Apple is essentially the bellwether of the market these days, and the fact that it's been so strong, I believe, has a lot to do with why the indexes have been so strong. So amazingly enough, the market, for all the look at the Dow real quick. The market's been kind of dull. I mean, you get these like wild, exciting days, like last Friday when there was all sorts of news, and then the following day, let's see, what was it? Monday. Oh, Monday was Columbus Day, and amazingly enough, it was the lowest volume day. Nobody really considers Columbus Day to be a huge holiday, even though the banks and the post office are closed. I mean, Columbus Day is one of those. But man, it was the lowest volume of the year. Really super dull. Can't tell by the Dow, but the S&P narrow range day here. Really really dull. Here's something interesting on SPY. The SPY, which I think is a better reflection of like the market open. Um, on Friday when we had all that crazy trade war news, right, was a gravestone doji. Doesn't really mean anything alone, but typically you get a run up gravestone doji, and the candlestick textbooks, especially if you get followed through to the downside the next day, will tell you that's bearish. But um, you know, didn't really turn out to be. So yesterday was a pretty incredible sort of look at a 5 minute chart. Yesterday was pretty amazing, right? I mean, market gapped up at the open, and then they just ran it up, ran it up, ran it up until lunchtime, or right around lunchtime, and then it just basically went sideways all day, and it was boring the rest of the day. So there's a lot of weird stuff goes on. It's like you could see there was volume, and you could see it kind of just drifting higher, like there was all these buy programs that were just accumulating stock. Like I guess I'm gonna say that all these companies that are buying back shares, right? I mean, stock buybacks are essentially what's sort of holding up the market, right? It's all about stock buybacks, especially with like the banks and that. I think I read that Citigroup bought back 76 million shares last quarter or something crazy like that. But yeah, these share buybacks, and so I'm gonna guess, and I'm almost certain about this, is that basically these companies that buy back shares, they take engage the services of companies like Goldman or J.P. Morgan, or the big Wall Street firms that like sort of they set like these algos to accumulate their shares, right? It's all done electronically, and they probably have they have certain things that they use to accumulate shares. And so, like, yesterday morning was a good example of, like, buyback accumulators just buying and buying and buying and buying. And then once they were filled up or whatever, then boom, they turn them off. The market just drifts sideways. So it's a crazy sort of phenomenon. But anyhow, just a lot of zigzagging, a lot of sort of non-committal price action, a lot of times gone by that the market has, just sort of ended up nowhere. Not that it hasn't had its big ups and downs, but it's just gone nowhere. And so anyway, this is sort of where we are here, and quite frankly, it's anybody's guess. So to me, the next big oh, and plus, Friday is options expiration day, 2 days from now. And over the years, the market's always tended to have a run up into options expiration day, and then just sort of I don't know what I would call this mysterious strength prior to OPEX, and that's been going on for a long time. So anyhow, I thought maybe we'd look at some of these pending trades today. Not a whole lot to really talk about. Earnings season, what the Fed does next, options expiration, um, all this nonsense about where we actually are in the trade negotiations or trade war with China. A lot of mixed signals there, and so everything's just kind of up in the air. But some of the open trades are looking pretty good. There's been a lot of weirdness there. A lot of this pending list was this is the one I was thinking about. This WLH right here. When I was talking about the home builders, take a look at this chart. I was looking at this earlier. This thing's, by the way, this is triggering like right now. Right? It's hitting the trigger, but look at this. Whoops, I didn't mean to add a note. I meant to draw a trend line. This is a pretty interesting looking little chart right here. Look at this. You got this beautiful little this is a good looking pattern, right? You got this sort of, the big sell off last year for whatever reason, the turnaround in January, which a lot of stocks have, and then there's there's like this zone here. Oh, there's like this sort of this resistance zone. I don't know if it makes much sense to take it back that far. I guess it does, but anyhow, this is looking pretty darn good here. I mean, that's a big basing pattern, and then you had a bunch of a bunch of pokes up right around $20, right around $20, and you got like this little W here. And anyway, it broke above it, and as we speak today, I believe that 2030 trigger price right there. And so there you go. 2030 trigger price right about there. And a little bit lower than that. 2030. Here we go. So there you go. That's a pretty darn good looking little sort of flag breakout there. And it's a strong sector too. Materials and construction, residential construction. I'm really surprised with the home builders being so strong. Kind of surprised that that this was still down so significantly from the prior highs, but got a good look to it. So I went through these pending stocks last night, and this one like really stood out at me. So I'm gonna just mark this right here because this is trigger 2030. So there we go. So this one's gonna most likely end up as a triggered trade today. Now it's got to close over 2030. Anything can happen, but does kind of look like it's going to. Um, and so there you go. When you zoom into it like this, I mean, it doesn't necessarily look so spectacular. But the further you zoom out, the better that looks. I mean, this one really sort of looks like it's got some potential. Next big zone of resistance is going to be up here around 22. So I like the look of that one a lot. All right, I had to make a note of something. Um, all right, so let's see what else we got over here on the pending trade. And go through these real quick. Let me pull them up on my other computer. Let's see, cone. It's always fun to look at these. Yeah, this cone's actually it's a REIT, but um, this one's looking pretty good here. A couple of the pending trades we looked at last week actually triggered, and so it was kind of interesting because I forget which one it was, but one of them triggered like basically like right where I had it marked. I was talking about how nice the chart was looking or whatever, and I did something like this, right? This is last week. I said, "Wow, this has really got a nice pattern here," and and it's got to go up a little bit to trigger. So this one right now the trigger's at 77. Its trigger's still up here, right? Trigger's still up there. So apparently a little more time needs to go by, but this trigger like will come down, come down, come down, and that's what I was talking about last week. And so I was looking at one of the recently triggered stocks where the exact same thing, right? I had drawn sort of the trigger area up here and then speculated that it was going to come down and come down, and then lo and behold it triggered like really super close to where I expected it to. And so ideally, I mean theoretically, you'd like the longer the duration pullback, the better sometimes, but this is a good looking chart right here. Any way you slice it. And so my guess is, depending on what this does today, I mean, it kind of looks like it wants to almost start turning back around, right? Almost. So not quite there yet, but we'll see. So all I can do is, but this is a good looking potential turnaround. and rally. This is a nice looking pullback in a stock that really has a habit of doing something. The only thing that concerns me is I haven't looked to see when their earnings are coming up. So let's see what else. PPC. PPC, a really nice trade back here in the summer. Closed ahead of earnings, and it actually popped on earnings, but it's in the process now of selling down. It doesn't look like triggering is imminent on this. So, and then of course we got WLH. By the way, I'm just gonna go down this pending list and look at these, and and they can drop off too. Like that PPC, if it starts to roll over, keeps going down, it'll just drop off the list. So WLH going to trigger today, looking pretty darn good. Let's see what else. MLHR is next. MLHR, Miller Herman. There's another one. Um, yeah, I mean it's interesting to see these things. This one got closed ahead of earnings last time. Look at that crazy earnings reaction, right? So it was a beautiful pattern last time. It triggered, on basically like on this trend line break, triggered right there. There was the there was the target. I didn't actually mark what the target was on there, but it was a decent trade. Closed ahead of earnings. Never did hit the trailing stop. It just basically had to get closed ahead of earnings, and then it had like that insane earnings reaction. Anyway, this is it's just another one that's potentially setting up here. I don't even like to draw that trend line. This is a pretty erratic sort of chart, so um, yeah, you're not too exciting here. I mean, sure, it's got a lot of potential, but crazy these crazy earnings reactions tend to screw up the chart. So, not the smoothest chart I've ever seen. FLY. I think I drew this last night when I was looking through these. Right now, the trigger price is at 1990. So that's going to be basically like this area right here. It's got a ways to go. Ideal, you got sort of it almost closed that gap, but not quite. But nice uptrend, nice sort of orderly pullback. Chances are this thing's not going to trigger. Well, I shouldn't say that, but it doesn't look like it's going to trigger anytime soon. Ideally, what would happen is it would kind of bounce around sideways, or whatever, and then break the trend line at the same time it hits the trigger price, right? There's potential that I had this drawn like this. There's potential that it could actually get a rally, close over the trigger before it breaks the trend line. So ideally, though, a little time. This would be a good one to keep an eye on, and this would be like that'd be like a great spot for it to for it to finally trigger. The more sort of consolidation that it has, and then the move up, I think the better. But well, this consolidation from the highs has been going on for a while here. So that's 9.6, and so it's a good sort of orderly consolidation pullback. There's so many charts. I like to look for similar patterns on the chart, but quite frankly, I mean, so many stocks, had massive sell-offs last fall, and then started rallying, around the beginning of the year. This one's a little bit different, um, but nevertheless, still a pretty solid uptrend. If I'm not mistaken, this FLY here, and I'm going to pull this up over at FinViz on my other screen here. Um, I remember from years back this thing having a big dividend. Um, I'm not even showing. They're not even showing a dividend. That's weird, huh? Top ranked value stocks. Blah blah blah. Where's the dividend? Where is the dividend? For whatever reason they're not showing it. Crazy if you look at the metrics on this stock over at FinViz, you see some pretty interesting stuff. They have $11.30 in cash per share. The PE is showing 4, right? Trailing 12 months earnings per share 469. Boy, this is wow. This is a weird sort of, and I mean obviously, like, the system is just choosing it because of the totally 100% based on the chart and technical analysis. But boy, this sure is a weird sort of stock, right? Aircraft leasing, which is a strange business. But it seems to me like back in the day, years ago, I remember this thing having like some sort of monster dividend. But I'm not really. You'd have to do some research on it. So, but that's pretty crazy. A PE of 4, $11 and something cash per share, book value per share $23. Wow, this is strange. Anyway, so much for that. I was thinking it had like some huge dividend. Maybe it does. Maybe FinViz just doesn't have it. So, a couple more in the pending list. LDOS. I don't know what this is, but it's not the most exciting chart in the world, but same sort of thing. You guys know that basically the pending list is comprised of stocks that you know are in relatively strong uptrends, and they're in the midst of they're in the midst of a pullback, right? And so, that's how the swing cycle usually goes. And so some of them are clean and some of them are not, but so stock big strong uptrend, and then it goes into multi-week or multi-month sort of pullback, and then the idea is that the pullback sort of comes to an end, theoretically, ideally with like a pivot low or some consolidation, some narrow range days, and then it turns back up and the trend resumes. Right? So this one sort of meets those specifications, even though like this current pullback's not really all that exciting. I mean, there's nothing that I really see on the chart right now to indicate that, hey, it's just gonna. Although, obviously it's at the bottom of this pattern, and so anyway, worth keeping an eye on maybe. Last but not least is this WST, West Pharmaceuticals. Huh, interesting. Medical instruments. That's another pretty strong sector, and nothing too exciting about nothing too exciting about this particular stock right here. Be honest with you. It's kind of an erratic looking top here, and it still meets the criteria. Obviously, stock in a it was in an uptrend, and then it had a big pop, and so now it's sort of to me this looks like it's sort of got a lot more work to do. It really does. So I'm gonna say that out of all of them, this WLH really looks like the potential to make a continuation move higher. Now, there was a similar flag over here where you got, this the same is very similar. Let me take this off of here. Right? That's kind of it's a big area because resistance, and now it's support. So that's definitely worth watching. But at the same time, kind of seen a similar pattern before. But I would say that one, or maybe the cone. That's a pretty good looking little setup right there. So there's a couple of them that look pretty good. So let's see, what's the market doing here. The market sold off earlier, and then it's kind of bouncing back a little bit. Kind of bouncing back. S&P's down up 5 points or something. So looking at um, looking at the stocks that oh, I want to look at whoops, typo. Auto Nation. This Auto Nation was one that was on the triggered today list here, and make sure I got this right. So yeah, this one's kind of weird because I mean it's the close above the trigger was basically like like an extra buck, right? So and then of course you got this gap up this morning, and so lately lately I've been thinking about a couple of different things when it comes to entries, and I did actually make some notes. Made some notes in the updated some notes in the documentation not that long ago, and you know we've talked in the past about waiting for the stock to they don't trigger until they close over the trigger price, and then like we've always said, become a buy for the following day. But I've been noticing that a lot of stocks over the next few days trade back at the trigger price. It's probably not a great example, although there's a lot of up and down volatility here, right? And so it's a double-edged sword, right? Like it probably wouldn't be a good idea to try and chase this up here. Um, Although, hey, you never know, right? I mean, it could just blast off and come up here, but this is one that watching it sort of on the pen if you're looking at it on the pending list or whatever. And that's why I like to go through that pending list, because some of the stocks, quite honestly, like that WLH, some of them look like you could go ahead and enter them as they're breaking through the trigger price when they're doing it, if the chart pattern looks right. So this one was a little bit dicey. The biggest problem with that is that sometimes they'll fade back down and never actually trigger, and I've seen a couple like that. So it's a double-edged sword, and a lot of times, like eyeballing this is a pretty good example. Like eyeballing the chart, you think, oh man, way past the trigger, but if you look at it, um, this one that's on the triggered today list. The open this morning was 28.98, and so you're talking, less than 50 cents, right? 48 cents above the trigger price. Not a big deal, and so it's still that's part of the judgment call there. There's a couple things you could get one of these. You get this big pop, and then over the next few days it just fades back down. So you can either set a limit. You can set a limit at the trigger price, or you can wait till the next morning, get in, and it's more of a judgment call. And this is the last one that triggered. Um, this is just, and so if you guys been around for and looked at these things long enough, you see everything happen, right? And so, prior to yesterday, like prior to yesterday, right? The trigger price was 25.75, and so that made perfect sense on the chart, right? Kind of made perfect sense, and so I haven't really been following this one on the pending list, but you know stock probably started pending, probably hit the pending list back over here somewhere, and and this 25.75 was the good trigger price. But obviously the system has doesn't know what the stock's gonna do, and so from here, instead of like coming up breaking this trend line and like what you'd want to see happen, and closing like right here above the trigger price. So it's pending with the trigger price way up here, and then you get this crazy gap up. And like, I don't know. I mean, there had to have been some news yesterday, right? Let's look at the 5 minute chart. So, I mean, it's just sort of the nature of this stock is that it just acts kind of weird. Let me see if I can and so it is what it is, right? Sometimes, I mean, sometimes there'll be cases where this happens and so, it is what it is. And that's again, that's sort of where the discretion comes. And let me see what the news is on this. And boy, I mean, this thing's just really taken off today, but it just doesn't look like there was a really good entry there. Um, what was the news yesterday? Oh, this is another home builder stock. Huh. The only news that I see is that I mean, well, there's something in Barron's, something at Barron's.com, and that was really it. I mean, other than they announced that they're going to have earnings conference call. I mean, there wasn't any news, so maybe it was the significant breakout with unusual volume. Oh, here you go. October 15th, they were upgraded by Royal Bank of Canada. This morning they were upgraded by BMC, and so someone, they got mentioned in Barron's, but that's kind of interesting. I mean, just out of nowhere, stock just sort of exploding higher to a new high. So yeah, it's a little tricky there. I mean, you don't basically it gapped over the entry, right? And then this morning gapped up even more, and so yeah. Eh, so basically on the triggered today list, that's the idea is that hey, you buy them at the open, and so you had to pay an extra buck for this one, which nobody likes to do, right? With a chart like this, but according to everything I'm seeing, looks pretty good, but yeah, as such is the nature. And so, even in the documentation and on past shows, we've always talked about how the gaps are what can get you, and same thing can happen on the downside, right? We've seen that before. It's actually been pretty rare, amazingly rare, that any of our open positions have big gap downs. Since the beginning of the year, when we launched this new thing here, I honestly I can't remember more than just I'm thinking like one, you know, maybe two at the most since the beginning of the year, like gap down through the stop on bad news. I can only. And so I'd just say that's pretty good considering there's been, hundreds and hundreds of stocks sort of cycled through the system. Let's see real quick, couple notable trades here. I wanted to look at Lulu, right? They've actually, for whatever reason, they've been talking about Lulu on CNBC. I guess they love to cherry pick stocks. I just heard something this week about Lulu on CNBC. Maybe they were talking about a halftime report. They love to cherry pick the stocks that, the big brand name stocks that are doing well. And I guess that makes sense. I guess that makes sense that they talk about a stock like this, but that was weird. That was my UPS beeping at me. I don't know what that was all about. Make sure I didn't lose the stream. Yeah, the stream's still going. Huh. If you heard that beep, that was that. So, anyways, Lululemon, right? And I mean, what a beautiful setup too, right? Earnings gap higher, whatever, whatever. Maybe that was an earnings gap higher too, but real nice, real nice sort of falling wedge type of pattern or whatever you want to call it. Whoops, real clean sort of. And when I say clean, the further you zoom in, the more the crazier this looks, right? Like you zoom in on it and it looks like some pretty wide, fast, wide and loose, I guess. Fast, wide and loose price action, but a lot of times that's where the big gains come from. So there was a target, 204. and plowed into that. Another one though that obviously another one that sort of blasted through the trigger price. So it is what it is. But anyway, hey, if like I always say, if you like what you see on the pending list, you probably it's not a bad idea to go ahead and follow it. And especially these big brand name stocks, not a bad idea to sort of to maybe follow the what's on the pending list there and get a little heads up, and maybe that way you can get in ahead of time, right? Let's see what else there was it this one? Yeah, this one was another one that, and this is weird. I mean, it just happens, right? What was that oh, it was Friday, right? This was, perfect setup here, right? Stock sort of pulled back, consolidating, and then you had this trigger like right over these highs. Then you get a big up day in the market like Friday, and it just rips right through the trigger price. And so it is what it is. Um, this one actually had a decent trade back here, back in July. Triggered right here, similar sort of. I don't say similar because it had ran up and consolidated, but triggered. Um, on this one here, it triggered and just barely above the trigger price, which was a lot better sort of a setup, and then had a huge run up, right? And then the old consolidation. Interestingly enough, it didn't. I guess this price action here wasn't conducive to catching this one, but anyway, it's at it again. I'm not sure if that was the one I wanted to look at or not. So I don't want to go down the whole list here of the open trades, but anyhow, um, so that's that. Looks like the market has had like this sort of all the bad news you can throw at this market. It's had a very mysterious sort of bid under it, and I think it's unusual. And hey, who knows what it is? Whether it's the final share buybacks before earnings are announced, or there's like a buyback. Um, what should I say? There's a share buyback blackout, and I think it's like a couple of weeks before a company releases earnings. But the funny thing is that the majority of stocks. I mean, there's a lot of the earnings season kicks off with like financials and this and that, but there's a lot of companies that they're still not coming out with earnings until around the beginning of November. So this could be sort of this run up that we've seen lately, besides news driven on the trade deal. The thing that gets me is that over the past year we've seen so many rallies on trade deal, positive trade deal, you know rhetoric, I suppose you could say, propaganda, you could almost say. And here we are. We got nothing. And so, and then everybody's out there saying that the big drops happen when there's escalation in the trade war. And so it's to me it's kind of nonsensical, but there's the IMF came out yesterday and downgraded the global growth outlook or whatever and blamed the whole thing on the trade wars. And so there's something to it, but something doesn't make sense because every time there's a positive trade war propaganda, the market goes up, and then when everybody figures out that no progress has been made, the market barely gives it back. It really doesn't hardly gives it back. The only time it gives it back is when additional threats are made, right? And it escalates. Then you get like, a little temporary pullback. So a lot of craziness to it. So anyway, I'm focused on, besides options expiration day, which I have a feeling has something to do with the with why we're sort of hanging in there. I'm kind of focused on end of the month, the Fed meeting, and where we're going to end up between now and then. So we could end up like right there. We could end up, up here at new highs, and so the month of October seems to be, we're halfway through October, and so far no big scary spooky surprises. And the fact that we're running up into the next Fed day makes me think that that'd be a pretty decent turning point. Of course, we're also heading, going into November, you get into the seasonally strongest part of the year. That's when the small caps, November and December is when the small caps, and in past years have always sort of, really outperformed. And so, Russell 2000, be interesting to see if this year the Russell be the thing to watch as we get into the end of the year, because if we see some strength in the Russell, then that would be a huge positive sign, a broadening out, so to speak, of the market. Because right now the market's extremely, I would say, extremely sort of narrow, right? Big giant cap mega stocks. I mean that you can, I can name on my fingers, you know, Microsoft and Apple and Google and Facebook, right? Netflix, kind of the FANG stocks are kind of so-so, but just a big handful of the mega cap stocks. Amazon, obviously, are sort of what's driving the market. And, the 2000 small cap stocks, as you can see here, still, 14% off their highs. So, anyway, it'll be interesting to see if towards the end of the year we can see some broadening out of the overall market. So, and it's always the divergences, right? The SaaS, the software stocks are getting hammered today, and the Russell's looking like it's on an upcycle here. So anyway, hey, well, thanks for tuning in. I will see you guys here next week.